to the Kent Lapp Podcast.
One of the things that's unique to the gospel of Jesus Christ is how multicultural and diverse and how universal it is at a cultural standpoint.
Right.
Because it's like the only religion out there, if we want to even call it a religion, where it sort of elevates specific cultures unless there's sin making up that specific culture, obviously.
Yeah.
But like, pick another religion where, if I dress in, if I wear a certain garb and now I become a believer, I don't need to change that garb,
Right.
but a lot of religions do, like you need to change what you dress and all those types of things. So that's one of the things that's, I think, unique to the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is so beautiful, is because culture came from, this was a God thing. Culture came from God, diversity and all these things. It's a beautiful thing. And so it's great that we get to experience that. So that's kind of on the one hand. And then on the other hand, you would have, I think, people saying, I just can't get past how you can vote for, say, Biden because he's Democratic and they are kind of pro-abortion, I guess, So what would you say to that?
I want to back up a little bit for that question and say we got to recognize what we're doing here in an election cycle. A lot of the decisions about who we get to cast a ballot for have been decided before tomorrow, right? Before we show up with our ballot, right? So to some extent, there's a question of how much influence do we have upstream from the presidential election day.
That's a great point.
And so when you're faced with what some people call a binary option, and which is some cases true, you can always vote for independents. You can do write-ins, right? I think number one, we've so, particularly in evangelical life, for years, decades, we have so inculcated the value of participation and voting that we have established participation in voting as a moral obligation. There's a lot of truth to that, I think. I could make a case for that. But what we haven't done is kind of parse the difference between, or this tension between voting, which is maybe the most pragmatic, the most practical act that we as private citizens do as far as self-governance. It's pragmatic, right? You're picking A or B, or C or D or F or whatever. At the same time, what we haven't cultivated, so we've established a moral obligation to participate in a very pragmatic thing. What we haven't cultivated is the mix in that pragmatic decision that is conscience. We haven't really schooled that up as much to teach people, look, there's a tension here.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe some races, it's probably not equal, it's probably not symmetric in every race, but I think when we cast a ballot, sometimes we do it with pretty full confidence that, look, I support this person. We kind of assume, when we feel good about a candidate, we kind of assume the conscience part of it because there's a harmonization there between the pragmatism of casting the ballot and our conscience because we align with that. What's been weird in the Trump moment and the Trump in 2016 and now is that there's a tension here, sometimes a split, basically, between what we believe is valuable policy and versus what we find objectionable to our conscience, all wrapped up in the same administration. And so there's a discontinuity there, to put it mildly in some cases, but there's a discontinuity between what we think is, for those of us who are kind of rightward leaning on public policy issues, we've spent years, decades even, on, say, like pro-life movement, developing really tight, precise rhetoric when we talk about abortion and how we talk about it. And we've got decades now of really professionalized pregnancy care clinics who really are highly professionalized and know how to speak to women who are, and mothers and families who are considering abortions. And there's a lot of rhetoric you don't use. Right? It's very strategic. It's very well formed. It's very thoughtful. It's well researched. It's very loving, very rooted in Scripture. And then you have a person who now is billed has been billed by some as the, quote, most pro-life president. And yet his rhetoric, either on the pro-life issue specifically or other issues that have nothing to do with abortion, you don't have that same kind of care and thoughtfulness on the rhetoric. We like the policy. We like the people he's appointed, say, even friends of mine at Health and Human Services. We like the justices, but there's a rhetorical split between, which you didn't used to have. Whether you aligned, you're speaking for someone who worked for the Southern Baptist Convention doing public policy stuff with that institution, whether it was Bill Clinton or George W. Bush or Obama, you kind of, the rhetoric always matched the policy.
That's interesting. Yep.
With Trump in office, all of a sudden you have a movement, the rightward movement, social conservatives, I'll specify, where the policy and the decisions appear really good in a lot of cases, but there's a really big disconnect. Now, the disconnect, the rhetoric specifically on life issues has gotten better. He seems to have been coachable. But, there was a time where you had a president, or I forget whether he was a candidate or a president then, but he more or less affirmed that, if Roe v. Wade was overturned, that we'd be locking up post-abortive women in jail. He rescinded that.
Wow.
But that's like a big time, what would you call it? That's not at all mainstream pro-life.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
Nobody ever, that's just not a thing.
Yeah, I didn't know you ever said that.
Now, there would be some, pro-life movement does support some legal consequences for abortion doctors, physicians who perform abortions. There would be criminal penalties for that. But he kind of played into the notion, and I had to go back and research it. And they rescinded it, I believe. But it was it was head spinning.
Yeah.
For someone who's been in the pro-life movement for a really long time to be like, this is not a thing, and you're kind of playing into the caricature of the pro-life movement from the pro-abortion industry.
Yeah.
So there were moments like that. It's just there's this tension.
Yeah.
So I'm getting well away from your original question.
Yeah.
But I think those of us who emphasize, say, pro-life stuff, religious liberty stuff, judges, we're looking at it through a lens that's very policy oriented. It's very pragmatic. It's we view it as hiring a CEO to do the mechanics of government,
right?
Which I think it's accurate. It's literally the executive branch. That's what we call it. He's not a king.
Yep.
He's not an emperor, or she, if a lady gets elected. At the same time, voters historically in America, we tend to lump a lot more than just CEO responsibilities into the presidency. My former boss, Richard Land, used to talk about, kind of make this contrast between the UK and America, where the UK, regardless of who's prime minister, you always have the Queen as kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of the mascot or kind of national identity, right? And so there's a certain amount of cultural value and ethos associated with the Queen and all that the UK Prime Minister doesn't have that baggage as much.
Sure.
Right?
Yep.
In America, we don't have royalty.
Yeah.
Thank goodness.
Yeah.
To be clear. But we still kind of, as humans, right? Israel wanted a king, right? We still kind of place that national identity. There's kind of an association of, this is the person who's representing our nation, and it's more, it's a little more esoteric. It's a little more transcendental, maybe.
Yep.
But I think there's people value that either consciously or consciously, and when you have a person like President Trump in that office, they really don't like that. And now people kind of on my rightward tribe, they're going to come back and say they're going to try to make some rational arguments against why, say, voting for a pro-life candidate or someone who's at least friendly to the pro-life cause, even in a transactional way, is going to save, say, X number of unborn babies' lives.
Yep.
And that's the conflict we're in.
Yeah.
Because I think it's really hard to weigh those metrics against one another. And I think we ought to be gracious to each other about how we weigh those.
And so maybe one of the arguments for someone who in a clean conscience would, and is a born again believer who believes in the gospel of Jesus Christ would vote for Biden, is because it's not quite as clean as you get Biden in, abortion still happens, you vote in Trump, abortion stops immediately, right? I mean, that's sort of obvious.
Right. Yeah.
But so then it becomes more nuanced, and it becomes, a little bit more, then you're looking at other policy and other motives for why you would vote. So is that fair? Is that why, plenty of believers will vote Biden and feel fine about it at a conscious level?
Yeah, I think so.
Even though they wouldn't, well, I guess I'm assuming that they would still be pro-life. I don't know. Is that it?
I think what I really care more about when I'm talking to Christians and how they're casting their vote, I care more about why we're casting our vote in a particular way. I think so. When I talk to friends on the left who are going to vote for Biden and think that it's unchristian to vote for President Trump, I'm in a position of defending Trump voters.
Yep.
For a number of reasons, we don't have to get into them, but I think there are. I'm not compelled to cast a vote for those reasons necessarily.
Yep.
But I would defend them,
Sure.
or say there's a thing that you need to consider. There are rational reasons why folks, especially in 2016, felt compelled to cast a vote for him. And frankly, in a much different way than I anticipated, he delivered on a lot of pro-life things. I have my other critiques of the administration, but there's reason. There are reasons there that aren't lumped up in the worst of what progressive may think about Trump voters. In the same way, I'm in a position of defending my progressive friends to my conservative Trump voter friends.
Sure.
To be like, look, these things are of value too.
Right.
And I don't see how we can discount them. And it's not like you can put things on a ledger.
Right.
And really compare these two. Like, people are going to feel more strongly about certain things. I just think they're they're different categories.
Yeah.
Like, I might be swayed by one or the other, but if we're talking about Christians participating in a liberal democracy and self-governance, like, I got to cut some slack to people who disagree with me.
Sure. Yep. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the great things about this country, right? Is we can have variants of opinion, and we can talk it out openly and have that freedom of speech and have civil disagreement. I mean, I think that's a wonderful thing. Can we talk about, were you going to mention something there, or can we talk about some of the articles?
Yeah, we can talk about some of the articles. I just want to put one more statement here is the debate about what we're doing on this particular election day. Whatever happens this week, and whoever's inaugurated or re-inaugurated in a few months, we need to reckon that we have, I think, the more compelling question than who are we voting for this week is, what are we going to do starting after Election Day to each, respectively, whether we're more in the Republican camp or more in the Democrat camp, to work to reform each of those political parties where they conflict with biblical values? That's the more interesting question.
Yeah, that is the more interesting question, and it's the more relevant question.
Yeah.
Because that's where we can change the world, so to speak, right? Or, start here and change America. I mean, that is the question. So, you don't need to talk about the articles right now, because I feel like there's more to jump in there on that point. So, do you have thoughts on how people, no matter if it's Trump or it's Biden, or it's for some, Kanye West, which is unlikely, but Trump or Biden, going forward, whoever you voted for, how can we work to reform, bring more of the kingdom of God into those political parties? Do you have thoughts on that?
I do. I think, number one, it's a long game. This is not something that is going to turn around in an election cycle or two. American politics is a long game. I think the best sports metaphor, I agree with Obama when he answered Jerry Seinfeld's question on this a few years ago. Which sports metaphor is the best for politics? Obama said football. And I agree, although for a few different reasons. Obama's description was accurate, but basically you got to think of football or American politics like a football game with no clock. The clock never ends, right? You've got different you've got different teams competing against one another. I would actually the metaphor would not be Republicans against Democrats. The metaphor is issue position versus issue position, and that's going to be different, right? So you've got pro-life, pro-choice on one playing field. You've got immigration reform and border security on the one, and that battle is going to play out in one way. The pro-life issue is going to play out in a different way. Both teams are trying to get to their respective end zones, that kind of thing. But the clock never ends. You might have one side that wins something like a Supreme Court battle that looks like a touchdown, right? And so this is it's just ongoing. So that's part of why I object to the most important election of my lifetime, because this stuff never ends. I heard the same kind of rhetoric during 2008 when Obama was running and then won, and then during 2012 when Obama was running and then won, and then who knew? We got President Trump. Who would have predicted? Yeah, nobody would have predicted the rise of, whether you want to describe it positively or negatively. Who would have thought in 2008 a wave like supported President Trump and then gave the Republicans 2 years of unified government? If you thought that Obama, as progressive as his administration was, if you thought and predicted that from 2008 or 2012 that this was going to be the result for 2016 and beyond, nobody predicted that. So I'm just saying we need to hold our future predictions more lightly and understand that it's an ongoing process, and that presidential election day is both, we tend to view it as like the capstone or the cornerstone of our self-governing participation. And for a lot of us it is. Look, we've got families to raise, kids to take to gymnastics and soccer and all that kind of stuff. And like our engagement of self-governance is very low for most of us, right? You and I pay attention to this stuff more than a lot of people. I'm a nerd about it, obviously. So we got to cut some people some slack. But to the extent that if both people who think Christians ought to vote for Biden or people who think Christians ought to vote for Trump, if you dislike the choice that we have, if you dislike the fact that we're arguing among Christians, I think the onus on us is to realize that controlling the levers of government is not the only objective here. We got to be controlling the levers of the parties who are giving us these options. And we got to bring those parties closer together for the sake of biblical values, right? Because right now we're in a situation where, frankly, we're being taken advantage of. Whether you're on the right or the left, you have a political party who's trying to drive a wedge between Christians. Political parties, even when they're most aligned. Let's say I'm a believer and you have a political party who is most aligned with my values. The political party does not bear the responsibility that you and I do as members of and representatives of Christ's kingdom. Right. Whether you're talking about local church as an institution or individuals, Christians living in the public square, we have a different obligation that political parties don't have, for good or ill. And I think when we kind of engage for the sake of getting our party to win, it's part of the game. It's part of self-governance. But if that's our only objection, and we're not working between elections to reform the parties, we're going to keep getting these kinds of results. Yes, if that's our only objective. You said objection, but I think you meant objective. Is that right?
Yeah. That's such a strong point. I totally agree with that.